Governors Association is holding their annual meeting this afternoon, a plenary session on innovation in America. We'll hear from former Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin and John Chalmers, Chair and CEO of Cisco Systems. This is scheduled to last about 90 minutes. And by the way, if you miss any of this session or this morning's session, which we brought to you, we will re-air it in its entirety starting at 3 a.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN.
Oh, okay, sure. Right. You guys are great. That's great. This is right in the summer.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
I got to go last night.
Yeah, rest it out for this year.
Well, it appears it'll be a minute or two before the NGA gets underway with this session on business and innovation. I want to go back and correct some information that we passed on to you about tomorrow's Washington Journal. Some of the guests will be Dan Gilgoff of U.S. News and World Report. He'll discuss his article looking at evangelicals in campaign 2008. After that, 3 governors will discuss this weekend's annual NGA winter meeting and what they believe will happen in next year's election. Republican Mitch Daniels of Indiana will be with us then, Kansas Democrat Kathleen Sebelius, and Republican Sonny Perdue of Georgia. And again, you can see Washington Journal tomorrow starting at 7 Eastern here on C-SPAN.
I know, yeah. We had plans to be here in the United States. And I said, the president is unwilling to walk and stuff. I didn't get to see him for 5 years.
Let me call us all to order. Hey, those of you that are talking, time to stop. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Janet Napolitano, the chair of the National Governors Association. Welcome to the beginning of our 2007 winter meeting. A little procedure to begin. I need a motion for adoption of the rules of the meeting.
So moved.
All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Part of the rules require that any governor who wants to submit a new policy or a resolution for adoption will need a 3/4 vote to suspend the rules to do so. So if any of you have new policies beyond those that have already been circulated, please get them to David Quam of the NGA staff by 5 o'clock on Friday. We have a number of new governors who are joining us throughout the meeting. Let me just list them for you. From Alaska, Governor Sarah Palin. Arkansas, Governor Mike Beebe. Colorado, Governor Bill Ritter. Florida, Governor Charlie Crist. Idaho, Governor Butch Otter. Iowa, Governor Chet Culver. Maryland, Governor Martin O'Malley. Massachusetts, Governor Deval Patrick. Nevada, Governor Jim Gibbons. New York, Governor Elliot Spitzer. Ohio, Governor Ted Strickland. And from the United States Virgin Islands, Governor John DeJong. Let's welcome the new governors. We are here today at this opening plenary to discuss the Innovation America initiative that the National Governors Association has embarked upon as part of the Chair's initiative this year. To do that, we will hear from two distinguished speakers, John Chambers, CEO of Cisco, Robert Rubin, former Secretary of the Treasury, now with the Hamilton Project. But before we do that, I thought I would thank a few people and then outline for us what it is this initiative is about. First of all, for this initiative to succeed, we brought together not just governors, but leaders from academia and leaders from the private sector. Many of them, in fact, most of them are here with us this afternoon. NGA Vice Chair, Minnesota Governor Tim Pawlenty, and the task force governors have been Governor Kathleen Sebelius of Kansas, Matt Blunt of Missouri, John Huntsman of Utah, Ed Rendell of Pennsylvania. We also have on the task force Craig Barrett, the chair of the board of Intel, Meg Whitman, the president of eBay, Dr. Mary S. Spangler, the chancellor of Oakland Community College, Dr. Judith Ramele, the president of Winona State University, Dr. Wayne Clough, the president of Georgia Tech, Dr. Michael Crow, the president of Arizona State University, Dr. Shirley Jackson, president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. In addition, we have on the task force, not with us here today, Chad Holliday, the chairman and CEO of DuPont, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, Kevin Turner, the COO of Microsoft, and John Thompson, the chairman and CEO of Symantec. And I'd like, on behalf of the governors and our staffs, to thank the task force members. Also would like to recognize Deborah Wynn Smith, who is the president of the Council on Competitiveness. We signed a memorandum of understanding with the Council this morning to work together to pursue the innovation agenda, and we appreciate their participation. So those are the welcomes and the thank yous. Now, what is this initiative all about? Well, in part, it's about imagining. I mean, we're so used to hearing our education system criticized, our economy worried about. But I think we also have to engage in the language and the language of possibility. Imagine, for example, having a medicine on your bedstand that is genetically and chemically tailored to treat your exact illness. Imagine having clothing that automatically adjusts to temperature, so you don't ever have to carry an overcoat again, or else you can move to Arizona. Imagine a programmed cell that searches through your body to make sure your glucose levels are safe, spotting cholesterol buildups. Imagine traffic systems, vehicular traffic systems that are not dependent on vehicles as we know them, but on new types of vehicles that emit actually nothing into the air. Imagine an education system where every child has an education program specifically tailored to him or to her, and is taught by someone who knows not only what to teach, but how to teach it. Imagine that world, and imagine the capacities we build in the United States and as states. Now, how do we get there? What is the language of possibility that we need to be using, and what are the governor's roles in this? And the language we use is the language of innovation. In the United States, we have always led as innovators. And to maintain ourselves and to build the kind of future we want for the next generation, innovation has to be the key word that we use, and the governors must accept a call to action here. We can no longer survive and thrive simply doing what we have always done. We're going to hear about that and some of the challenges we face from the speakers we've invited to this meeting. And I think we all know about it independently in our states. from what we see and experience every day. So our job as governors, as the leaders on education and economic development within our states, in our states we serve as hubs of a wheel of a number of different aspects, is to bring those aspects together and to talk and persuade the people about the urgency of innovation and why it is that this needs to be taken on at every level. And so that by the end of our efforts, everybody in America understands that this is the innovation generation. And that's what we're all investing in. And that's why we're investing in our schools. And that's why we're creating more capacity in computers and math and science. And that's why we need government, the private sector, the not-for-profit sector to be combining their efforts together to get there. This initiative to help governors lead that discussion has three parts. The first part is something that we have talked about already, and that is the education in science, technology, engineering, and math, the so-called STEM subjects in our public schools. What do we need to teach? How do we need to teach it? How do we develop the teaching capacity for that? How do we do that? How do we do that quickly? How do we do that quickly? This is not a subject to be studied. It is an issue to be confronted and dealt with now. So we're going to be talking about so-called STEM education. But hopefully we'll get some creative and innovative ideas about what ought to occur. Because if we're simply talking about teaching equations and formulas in a classroom, I'm not sure we're going to be exciting the next generation of students or indeed preparing them for the world they're going to be entering into. So we need to talk about STEM education as transformation, transformational education. So that's the first part of this initiative. And there will be grants and so forth. In fact, we announced $3 million in grants this morning from Gates and the Intel foundations to facilitate projects on STEM education in the states. And you'll want to be looking into that. The second part of this initiative deals with post-secondary education. This is a new one in many respects for the National Governors Association. We know we have these great assets in our states. Our community colleges, our private universities, our public universities. We know that there is lots of research and creativity going on there, but it hasn't gone on in the sense of being part of an overall strategy for a state, strategy for an economy, or tied into what other things that we are doing. So that's why we have invited these leaders from different areas of academia to join us, because this is an area that needs, I think, further work by the governors as to how these assets can better be employed as we move into the 21st century. So K-12 STEM, use and linkage with and alignment of that with our higher education institutions. And then the third part of this is then how do we translate that into the workforce of the future? What kinds of jobs, job creation capabilities will we have? Will we be able to grow and sustain if we have a successful innovation agenda beginning at the earliest grades in our schools? And the whole goal is really to move this country forward to say, you know, we are at a critical economic time in the world. It has changed very rapidly in our lifetimes. It has changed very rapidly since many of us have been governors. And it is changing ever more rapidly every day. As governors, we need to lead this charge because in our states, our budgets are focused on public education. We have a great deal to do, particularly with the community colleges and public universities, but also with private institutions as well. And we work day in and day out with our private employers and businesses in terms of how we insource jobs, not just competing against other states, but indeed around the world. During the course of this meeting, we will be giving you a boatload of materials, all of which I'm sure you will read. But there's some really, really good stuff. There's a call to action, which is what this is today. There will be information that we will give you later this afternoon, a state-by-state analysis of where you are. Where is your state in terms of some economic measures maybe you haven't thought of before, to help you begin to formulate your own framework that is state-specific for you, because as you know, every state will have its own issues and we'll be starting from a somewhat different place. We'll be talking about ideas for federal legislation, and we know both in the House and in the Senate there are bills in draft stage right now that we want to be working on with members of the Congress and of the Senate. because that needs to move forward right now. So those are just a few of the things that you will see and obtain. So that is the initiative, Innovation America. And I think it opens up a world of possibility and opportunity for us. But I'll tell you, nothing is going to happen unless governors take the lead on this. This is not a federal issue that's going to be guided out of Washington, D.C. It has to be led by you. It has to be led by the governor of Mississippi, by the governor of Nevada, by the governor of Washington, all over this table, all around this table. We've got to lead this. And we cannot look back at our constituents 4 or 8 years hence, whenever our terms end, and said, we did a job for them, unless we take this on now, and in a serious result-oriented way. So that is what we are about this afternoon. That is what the breakouts will be about tomorrow. They will focus in the morning on STEM and economic development. We will have a plenary tomorrow as well that will talk particularly about math and science education, which is a challenge for all of us, and how we develop the capacity for that. And at the end, by tomorrow, we will finish up with a presentation by Frank Luntz, who many of you know, who does polling and messaging and all of those sorts of things. And I asked him a basic question. I said, how do we talk about, as a governor, how do you talk to somebody about innovation without having their eyes glaze over? Well, what are you talking about? You know, it's kind of a new concept. How do we bring this home and talk about, what do people think about it already, and how do we talk about it with a perhaps more apt vocabulary than we're using today? And that's how we'll finish up tomorrow before the traditional dinner at the White House with the President. So there we are. That's how we're starting. I welcome you all here and look forward to spending the next days together on this and on so many of the other issues that governors are dealing with. So we'll begin with our first speaker, and here's what we're going to do. We'll have our first speaker. Maybe I will ask a question or two of him, and I'll introduce the second speaker, and then we're going to throw it open to everybody to ask any question of either speaker till the end of this session. The first speaker is John Chambers. He has been the president and CEO of Cisco Systems, Inc. since 1995. He was recently named the most influential CEO in telecommunications by Institutional Investor magazine and the most influential person in communications by Telecom magazine. His other awards include the Smithsonian Lifetime Achievement Award and the Presidential Ron Brown Award for Corporate Leadership. Please join me in welcoming John Chambers.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be back with you again. I was here about 5 years ago, and at that time it was a chance to really talk about technology, and everybody wanted to be a part of that. But many people were thinking about, how does technology really play a role in terms of where you're going? And today I'd like to challenge you. Technology is not innovation. Technology enables you to innovate. Trying to do something before there's the right market transition or tipping point is like pushing a rock up a very steep hill. You can't do it. But when the tipping point is achieved, then suddenly you can do things you could not do before. The governor challenged me yesterday saying, John, kind of frame it not in the question of why should you do something, but why not? Go ahead. Now this is where I basically continue to talk and you don't notice the distractions going on in the background. But if today you agree with everything I've said, I have failed. My goal is to create what is possible, because the limitation on most of the issues that we challenge ourselves as a state or a country, education, healthcare, public safety, infrastructure, etc., are actually very much enabled in terms of their solutions by technology. And yet it is often the roadblocks, consciously or subconsciously, put in place. I just returned from the Business Council down in Florida a week ago, and it would surprise you. The business leaders, as you would expect, we all think about how do we grow our top line, bottom line, how we get closer to our customers, how do we build in productivity and flexibility. But our public policy issues that are most important to us are identical with what you've told us in preparation for this session. And when you have that common opportunity in front of you and you think about technology as how you enable these changes, and let me emphasize the word change. Change makes all of us uncomfortable. If all you do is put in technology, you're going to be disappointed in the results. And it enables your strategy. Everything I do at Cisco is enabled by my technology. And usually when I get in trouble is I do a command and control mentality and don't build it into the process through technology. I get the short-term results, and then later on it's just like wearing each of the schools or putting a lot of PCs out there. You're going to be disappointed with what occurs. I've talked to almost every government leader in the world on a global basis, not because we're particularly fascinating, but because they understand the role the technology, especially the internet, will play in the future of their country. And this goes from India to Australia to Japan to China, across North America, Latin America, France, Germany, UK, Eastern Europe, almost all the Middle East countries. And there is a common understanding today that if you're going, regardless of your form of government, if you're going to be successful as a leader, you have to create jobs and economic stability. The key to that is a basis in education. The second key is literally how you create an infrastructure. And the old world infrastructure used to be electricity and water and highways. And not to say they aren't important, they clearly are. But the new world infrastructure is about broadband. How do you deliver services, education, job creation, etc.? Within that, you've got to have supportive government. And my view of government used to be the further we stay away, the better it was. And boy, was that naive. Because not only do we have the same objectives in business, we have exactly the same challenges that must be addressed in a combination of collaboration. But at the heart of things is this innovation agenda. And I cannot emphasize how important that is. Thinking out of the box and moving to where the next form of productivity will be, which will be in collaboration. Not in entering transactions over the internet or getting an answer back, but how do you together solve problems? How do you create that within your administrations and within a loose coalition of organizations? I'm going to walk you through a day of a person's life. I would say the people in this room can largely determine whether that's a day in a person's life a year from now in your state or 10 years from now. It won't be technology that's the limitation. As you get up in the morning, you'll immediately be able to log on in whatever format you want through whatever device, to the news, to the sports update, to the messages from your friends, etc., and it will come out in the format you want. You'll be able to see how did your White Sox perhaps do in terms of statistics. Did they get beat by the Cubs or the Diamondbacks? How did that go? My brother-in-law is going to send me a clip about North Carolina beating Duke, which I hope I don't see. You will see it organized in the format that you want. You'll immediately get update in terms of your searches if you're in business or in politics about what are the key items you want to see. You would then be able to do your healthcare monitoring, not by going to a clinic or otherwise. You'll collect that data at home, and I'm saying way beyond blood pressure. Most of the work you do in clinics will be done in the home in the future. You will be able to get an update. It will automatically get prioritized by your doctors or nurses, let you know if you've got an issue. It maintains your consistent base. You'll be able to see how your parents are doing, perhaps halfway across the country. Are they following on their prescription or not? Do you need to punch a button and have a in-person in-life experience where I can read your pupils in your eyes with my father to say, Dad, how come you're not taking the medicine? Or the ability all of a sudden to punch another button and I can communicate with my operations halfway around the world, have a meeting with a customer, or have a meeting with my own employees. As you think about where that's going to go, each of us will have our own devices. Now, you can do everything I'm saying without leaving your home if you decide to do so in the future. Or you can literally rotate over to your car. As you go into your car, you might have gotten emails. Well, you're clearly not going to read an email or watch a video as you go to work. The email will automatically be translated into voicemail. I realize it's politically correct to say this is a hands-off device, regardless of how you do it. The ability literally to look at it and say, here's who I want to talk to, prioritize this, respond to it as we go forward. I remember that I want to go to the ball game tonight with my dad. I basically purchased the tickets on the way. I can either have them electronically barcoded into the handheld set that I have or have them printed out on my printer at home or the office, and as I go into the ballpark I can automatically upgrade the tickets as we move forward. I can then have a series of meetings rotating around the world with my organization as though they're physically in the same room, or I can physically go into work and implement the capabilities. As you begin to think about stuff being delivered to your home, to your work, based on your preference where you are in the world, it could be delivered by mail or any other category. And what you will see is a constant series of meetings and interactions and collaborations that make just entering an order online over the internet or getting information back like child's play. The ability, literally, if you were to go to a ball game as opposed to taking off a little bit early from work, I can look at the highway, figure out which way is the best way to go there. I can basically also figure which other of the employees at Cisco may be going and ride with them, or meet my father there or my friends and go to the ball game. And by the way, as I go to the ball game, I can automatically get an update if I'm running late, hear it on my capability and the device in the car. As I get out of the car, it rotates over to my either a handheld PDA type of device or a cell phone, walk into the game and see it live. By the way, I'll be able to do that exact same experience sitting in a restaurant there with visuals. Though if I have a box seat in the ball game, I'll watch it from whichever angle I want. I'll do my own replays. I'll bet what the next pitch is going to be, the implementation. I'll probably send a note to a friend who again is rooting for the wrong team. Take a video clip of that, shoot it across the stadium or around the world. The ability literally to think about where this is going to go in the evening and say when I return in the evening, especially if I haven't taken my spouse with me to the ball game, we'll already have it aligned in terms of her Desperate Housewives not overlaying my Duke basketball game. We can watch Grey's Anatomy if that's what she or I decide to do at that point in time, or we can watch 24. I can also finish up the evening if you had kids at home in a way that I could then contact Australia or Japan, finish up the meetings there, do a video message for my employees for the next day. Technology would not be the limitation here, and it isn't so important the items that I just went through. It's what is capable of being done. Think about what that means to education, healthcare, public safety, etc. Now, one of the most basic premises that I'll challenge us with is that when we make movements in these areas, if we think about execution without taking the step back and say, what is the overall vision? What is our differentiated strategy? Because if we're easy to do, it would already be done. If you do it the way others have already done and they failed, you're going to get the same results. And then what are your execution measurements? This is how I think about it in business, and I explode every idea, whether it's the company strategy down that way, moving into new emerging markets, which are growing at 40% a year for us with the exact same profitability the U.S. is, never been done before, leader in multiple product areas, or corporate social responsibility. So as we think through this, kind of frame it in terminology that we can talk the same language. Think about what is capable in each area. What is the vision in terms of what can be done? We all understand the vision in terms of education. Education for education's sense. In fact, even degrees may go away in the future. It's more a skill set we're after. Does that skill set really give the skills for where the job needs to be created? West Virginia is an example, training people at West Virginia University for the FBI labs 20 miles away. Specific job creation that is done in that way, not the way we were trained by the same textbooks that our children are now using that we're using, but a collaborative way of training that you see down in Mississippi, to where the capability in Mississippi for the teacher to present a context, you actually vote in terms of answers to questions she asks you. He or she, in terms of teaching it, realizes, did the students get what they're after? Which students may need a little bit extra help? A different form of education. As you think about public safety, the ability to be adaptive is key. Because whatever we define and how we think it's going to occur isn't what's going to occur. How do you really have the capability, much like you see in defense, for any warfighters, what they see, the ability to simulate that and put it in a database you can gain access to with proper authorization. Same thing's true in public safety. And how do you coordinate these various organizations with a common infrastructure? Now, you know where I'm headed with this. It's the ability to outline the vision of what we want to accomplish, whether it's infrastructure in highways or green emission issues or infrastructure in terms of broadband, and then saying what is the differentiated strategy to get there and how do you measure the execution implementation as that occurs. Now, often people talk very nicely conceptually, you feel good about it, and then you say, all right, give me one example. And they immediately hesitate. So when I talk about these issues, these are what I've seen done around the world as well as in this country. And I'll use some simple examples of it. If you think about education, Cisco Network Academies, we have 500,000 students in the world, 167 countries. Out of that group, we've had 2 million graduates. 91% of the graduates, and we survey over 30,000 of them a year, would say that they use what they learned every day in their work or their entertainment. 79% of those pursued more interest in IT, and 29% of them actually ended up with jobs in IT. Jordan Education Initiative, almost an impossible task. A country that does not have any natural resources other than their own people and an education system and a very enlightened leadership in King Abdullah and Queen Rania. The willingness of the World Economic Forum for 17 companies to come together at the forum to literally, we were honored to take the lead in that, to partner with 17 Jordanian companies, 11 NGOs, not only to wire the schools, but to develop computer games in math and science for kindergarten, first and second grades that teach them in Arabic the capability to do that. Something to be pretty nice for our own schools, wouldn't it? And then to look at venture capital, how do you bring it in? How do you create the jobs that go with it? And in one of the most challenging parts of the world, a GDP growth of 8 or 9%. The ability to say what is possible. And you begin to think about how this comes down to the Mississippi Education Initiative in terms of how a state really bounced back in the leadership at the governor level, at the superintendent of school levels, and a willingness to try pilots to where you literally are going to encompass 30,000 students in the southern part of the state, You will think about how do you eliminate the digital divide with a wireless capability over it. You incent the teachers and others to do curriculum that is based upon the internet. You allow the students who are sitting there to suddenly say, here's the testing that's going on. Do I understand it or not? The teacher can back up or go forward within it. You know where I'm headed. The ability to rethink an education system. Something that technology is not the limitation of. It's the question of why, here are all the problems, here's the challenge, and it's difficult, or why not. The capability to think about it in terms of health care, where Mr. Blair, literally in the United Kingdom 6 years ago, said, John, I want you to help me with the health care system. I about passed out. And he said, John, it isn't as bad as the U.S. And he put in place a series, and I say this because all of us have a tendency to say why, including myself, as opposed to why shouldn't we go after it. He put in place a beginning of an architectural approach, and I will tell you now that out of the $2 trillion challenge we face in expenses in healthcare in this country, technology can conservatively take out 15% of it, probably 30 to 40%. And if you combine that with the indirect costs for the 40+ million uninsured we have in this country, there's more than enough money to pay for this if we just learn how to prioritize it, make some of the tough decisions that there are a lot of good reasons why the regulations were done originally, but how do you make it seamless across this organization? How do you do that in a constructive way? I can tell you our global competitors are addressing that. Part of the reason the Europeans are, they're going to go bankrupt. In Italy, 2/3 of people will be retired in 40 years. We all understand what the implications are for the social system. And it's to have the courage to think out in terms of what you do this. When you talk around the world, Japan got that broadband was the highways of the future. And it's not by itself the solution. All they do is create the highways on it. Their broadband capability of their citizens is 20 times the speed at 1/20th the cost of our country. The ability literally to tie broadband to economic advantages, where Senior Minister Lee in Singapore clearly understands he's going to put something called a gigabit to every home in Singapore. He's always been the leader. A gigabit is only about 1,000 to 10,000 times faster than what we connect our homes with. And that will change his healthcare system, it will create job creation, it will allow them, a nation of just several million, to compete in a new global environment in a unique way. The same thing as you look down through it in terms of what is possible, and you look at what California is an example of doing. Being realistic on the challenge, but taking back an executive order and say, here's what we have to do, here's what we're going to form the task force on broadband, we're going to blow away the roadblocks, we're going to be realistic in terms of how we have to address that, and here's our execution model that we're going to measure our success or not by. And if you look literally at public safety and you begin to think across borders and capabilities, many of the countries in the world, whether it's Saudi Arabia as an example, where we're building out the whole infrastructure for their cities they're building from scratch, are all based on a common network architecture, of which security is like the human body. If you think about it, the human body gets attacked thousands and thousands of times a day by viruses, and yet it coordinates in a unified approach that causes you not to have to call a doctor or not to take a half an aspirin, except as an exception. It's that basic architectural approach in terms of what is capable, and you begin to take that in small steps. Virginia and North Carolina is an example. Danville on the border, using Virginia Tech resources and the Department of Justice work together. How do they just do basics on exchanging information for some of the challenging elements they see in their community that go back and forth across the border? But it only starts if you have a vision of what is possible. What is your sustained differentiation, and understand that if you don't do it differently than it was done before, you're going to get the same results. And then how do you realistically measure the execution, and how do you have the courage to make mistakes? Because we will if we move into these aggressively. The ability to literally think about this. Now you can say, John, that's nice you're talking to us as governors. How about in your own life? This is exactly what we do at Cisco. You invest $1 in us when we went public, it's worth $150,000 today. It's not too late to invest, even in today's terms. Many people said you can't move into new markets. Basically, you aren't going to make money in these emerging markets. We said, let's make money and lead. We're growing at 40% a year in the emerging markets around the world, and they're as profitable as where we are otherwise. Corporate social responsibility and good business doesn't tie together? Nonsense. I learned that 15 years ago in China. They go hand in hand. We're #1 in corporate social responsibility as measured by the State Department or our CEO counterparts of large companies in America. And you know what I'm sharing with you? Reinventing innovation. Innovation used to be you do it yourself. Definition of innovation to me is if you're not in the first 5 in the market, you buy one of the first 5 or your partner. Now you say, John, simple strategy. 90% of acquisitions in my industry fail. I've done 118. 70% of them exceeded what we told the board of directors we would do. So it is the capability to stay on track in terms of vision, differentiated strategy, and execution that I think is key. Catching market transitions when they're ready. We could have never been a telephony player if it hadn't changed to using telephony over IP. And if voice wasn't going to commoditize, and I wish I hadn't said this, but voice will be free. We said it 10 years ago, it will be. But it's realizing where this market goes and seeing it not 1 year out, but 3, 5, and 10 years out. And how do you catch the transitions which will allow you to address the issues of commonality of healthcare or others? And technology should be the enabler of almost everything you do. It will allow this next generation of productivity not on transactions, but a collaborative approach to everything we do. We talked earlier about the stadiums. We did this purely as a way of keeping one of the baseball teams in our area. We said, let's move to the South Bay. We'll help you on the revenue generations. Many of the other teams around the league pay 3, 4 times as much for payroll as we did. We looked at how we changed wiring that and generated additional revenues. Literally, so when I go into the stadium with my virtual ticket on my cell phone, I scan it through. I may decide there are other tickets available. I'll upgrade, sell my ticket back to somebody else. As I walk through, I happen to like Diet Coke, and I happen to like popcorn, and unfortunately I like donuts, and I can have whatever I want delivered to my seat at the time that I want. I'll sit there with a device. I'll communicate with other people within the group. If my son decides to propose to his wife, thank goodness, he can do it on the scoreboard, screening that, of course, ahead of time. As you exit, they'll tell you which way to exit. They'll tell you if there's a problem in the stadium, how to go out. Whole bunch of new revenue sources, over 80 different applications to go with it. And what we thought would be one stadium now is going into 30 stadiums across the nation, literally in 6 months. My point being, until you say what is possible and what's the business or governmental goal you're trying to do, then think out of box on innovation. We would have never thought about how you move wiring a stadium to regenerating new revenues if somebody hadn't asked and said, we'll partner with you to get there. Healthcare, probably the biggest challenge of all. You have the people who pay and the people who consume it and the people who deliver it are all different with different systems. You have to go back to a common medical record. You have to take this a step at a time. You have to blow away the roadblocks. But it's something that I feel personally very comfortable with. At a minimum, you can save 15% of that $2 trillion. At a maximum, perhaps 30 to 40%. But you only do it if you don't develop solutions in silos. If you develop solutions that are architecturally integrated together. If you begin to get the best minds together who don't have a strong opinion on a transaction, but say, here's my definition of success, here's my vision, here's the strategy I want you to do, now show me how you're going to do it. That type of opportunity, I think, is doable within the group. Now, you can talk about that conceptually. What we've seen is you break it down, you look at how it occurs, how easy is it to implement from technology or change, what's the payback, and you begin to add it up, and this is probably one of the more conservative estimates that I've seen. But if you think about healthcare, starting with common prescriptions, your ability, you will eliminate over 100,000 deaths a year if you just have the capability to match common prescriptions. Yet with most seniors, it scares you to death. They walk into the doctor's office, what prescriptions you on, they pull out a wrinkled sheet of paper because they got them from different areas. Your common medical record will automatically match that. Both my parents are doctors. They will tell you that no doctor knows more than probably 20 drug interactions well themselves. But you begin to think about all of a sudden caring from our aging population from home in an even more respectful way, being able to, for them to continue to live their lives, etc., and beginning to address this problem at the same time. Government leaders around the world get this issue on broadband. The U.S. is clearly leading on IT implementation. We are woefully behind in broadband. France, which had 1% penetration 2 years ago when I talked to the French Senate, and they were already headed this way. And it was amazing, regardless of their political parties, their view on this. They now are at 20% broadband penetration with a national policy on how to get there. And a time frame about how do they move the roadblocks apart to make that happen. And a realistic view that when you're in this area, what can be done. Here's an idea, not all the answers, but the concepts. Have literally, what is your statewide policy on this? What are the roadblocks to get it to achieve? Set an aggressive goal on the time frames and implementation. Partner with business, and if they don't partner, give them a nudge the other way to encourage them to partner. Blow away the 30,000 restrictions of local government that will prevent you from implementing this. Give them a reasonable return on their investments as they go through it. Not necessarily these are the right answers, but thinking again in terms of what is possible. Broadband to every home within a state, within a country, whether you say in 4 years, 6 years, or 10 years. And I would argue when that occurs is largely what objective do we set and how hard do we go after it in terms of making it happen. A phenomenon that is very important. Several of you asked me, say, John, share with me what your fears are or what your opportunities are or concerns about how the other countries are moving. World GDP is going to be in other countries other than the developed countries. It's been out of line for 100 years, and now you're really watching what's occurred in the developing countries. But interestingly enough, they aren't going to follow the U.S. and say 3, 5, or 10 years behind us, they're going to jump a generation on their education, their infrastructure build-outs. And they clearly understand that globalization has a tremendous amount of very, very positive things, but it creates opportunities for them and for us, as well as challenges that they don't address. The ability literally to think about having a virtual meeting. Now think what this means. I'm not talking about video conferencing. I'm talking about the capability literally to play Texas Hold'em across the table from somebody, see their pupils dilate when they get a great card. What I'm really talking about is different business models. The capability to meet with perhaps 10 of my top people in 10 different locations, where whoever's talking rotates on the screen. And after they talk, literally, somebody else comes up. The dominant PC keeps you in line along that line. It is probably 98% as effective as just the meeting we're having today. In fact, I'd argue maybe even more, because I can see the governors on the other side of the table much more effectively this way. Now, it isn't so important the technology, and I'm not talking about just how you communicate with your key teams. Think about as this goes to the home, as Moore's Law, doubling the price performance every 18 months, brings it to the home. What does this mean on how you deliver education, health care, etc. within it? Point I'm making is technology will not be the limitation. And by the way, we as the company stepped up to next year eliminating 10% of our carbon emissions just by how we use this technology and change our business model. And at the same time, touching our customers more often, not less. And at the same time, literally changing business models. So the $150 million is just an ante. The real value is how I change my support structure and direction. One other element that I thought might be of interest to you is that the next level of productivity is in collaboration. And we were not trained in school for this. In fact, the reverse. We usually competed against the person sitting on our left and the person sitting on our right. But collaboration, when taking to the efficiency, and I think, Governor, your challenge is to think about how the governors work on common issues, is the next model. What I do now is I can take any two of my senior VPs, regardless of their function, put them over top of a new emerging market responsibility or a new industry I've moved into the consumer or a challenge that I face perhaps with a competitor out of China, and then I put functional groups, each person from each functional group, as part of that team, and they have to speak for the whole functional group. Now, you could say simple concept. When I first did this 6 years ago, I did it with everyone kicking and screaming. The first 2 years were a disaster. I ended up having to pay my team on teamwork as measured by 6 of their peers. 2 of my top senior VPs got no bonus 1 year because of it. But today, this allows me to move across the front in multiple capabilities with efficiencies across multiple markets that my peers can't keep up with. Now, there's the proof point in terms of concept. But this is really, I think, how we address many of the issues that we're talking about today or how we run our operations on a regular basis. So, again, if you agree with everything I've said, I haven't done my job. Even when we changed the logo of our company, the vast majority of our senior team resisted it at first. We had to communicate it. We had to take steps, implement the vision and strategy. So my job is really to challenge you in terms of what is possible. I hope I've done that, Governor, and I return it to you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you very much for those remarks and giving us some ideas on how we can get at this. Let me now introduce our second speaker. Robert Rubin has been the director and chairman of the executive committee of Citigroup since 1999. Prior to joining Citigroup, he served in the Clinton administration as assistant to the president for economic policy and the first director of the National Economic Council. He then served as secretary of the Treasury from January of 1995 until July of 1999. He also currently serves as the chairman of the board of the Local Initiative Support Corporation, the nation's leading community development support organization. He is the author of An Uncertain World, Tough Choices from Wall Street to Washington, which was named one of Business Week's 10 best business books in 2003. Mr. Rubin is a founding member of the Advisory Council to the Hamilton Project, an economic policy initiative at the Brookings Institution. Please join me in welcoming Robert Rubin.
Thank you, Governor. I'd like to start with a question for John. How do I invest in your company at the original price? I don't think there's an answer to that question. Any event, the governor asked me if I would discuss my views for a little bit about the United States economy, the outlook, and the relevant policy issues as a framework for everything that you'll be doing, which I am delighted to do. Let me start by saying that I believe, as the governor and I were discussing before, that governors are in a position to play a central role in meeting our nation's challenges, and I believe this is taking place at a time when our country, if you take a longer-term perspective, is at a critical juncture with great opportunities, but also critical challenges. I speak a lot with major investors, with policymakers, with business people from around the world. And while there are quite different views as to the probability of various future scenarios, there is virtually universal agreement on the notion that this is a very complex time in global economic history, with great potential, but also serious risks. Interestingly, if you look at global markets, that's not reflected, though that notion of risk is not reflected at all. A very well-known European investor, a friend of mine, told me recently, or he said to me recently, that the only undervalued asset in the world today is risk. And I think that's right. But that view of the markets does not change, at least in my judgment, the realities, and I've spent my whole adult life around markets. My comments go to the longer term, which in my judgment is the appropriate perspective for policymakers. Let me make one brief comment as to the shorter term, say the next year thereabouts. Clearly there are risks, although most economists feel that there's a pretty high probability that we're going to have good economic times, good GDP growth during this period. Having said that, the growth that we have today, and I'll get back to this in a few moments, is very much dependent on multiple levels of borrowing throughout our society, throughout our economy. And at least in my judgment, that growth has masked unsound underlying fundamentals from the multiple imbalances I just mentioned, to suboptimal public education, which are a very serious issue for our future and which in my judgment must be addressed if we're going to have the potential, the great potential that I believe this country has. At the present time, at least in my view, in terms of meeting those challenges, we are far, far from where we need to be on virtually every front, without regard to the question of how you assign political responsibility. To proceed, I believe that the global economy today is at a time of transformative change of historic proportions. My successor as Secretary of the Treasury and then became President of Harvard, Larry Summers, one of the truly outstanding economists in America, gave a speech about a year ago, thereabouts, in which he said he thought the changes that are going on today in the global economy were probably the most important since the emergence of the United States over 100 years ago, or perhaps even since the Industrial Revolution. Tremendous technological change, the spread of market-based economics and productivity policies around the world. Effective productivity policies, particularly, as John mentioned, a number of the major emerging market countries, the reduction of barriers to trade and to investment. And as a consequence of all that, the emergence of China and India as large potential markets, but more immediately as powerful competitors, creating historic change in the global competitive environment. Our economy, the economy of the United States, has enormous strengths. A dynamic culture, flexible labor markets, a willingness to take risk, sheer size, and I believe, without question, that we could thrive in this transformed environment, particularly since a period of great change can be especially beneficial to an economy with the flexibility of ours. Having said that, to realize that potential, we must meet hugely consequential challenges. And the other side of that coin is if we don't meet those challenges, I at least believe that at some time we could have serious difficulties. In that sense, the United States is at a critical juncture for the longer term. And how we do at this critical juncture will be enormously dependent upon how well our political system rises to meet our challenges. And I believe in that respect that states and cities can play a major role in this response. Moving forward, in my judgment, is going to require a political system in which there is a willingness to reach across party and ideological grounds to find common ground, a willingness to acknowledge difficult realities and difficult issues and difficult trade-offs, and finally, a willingness to make politically tough choices. And I believe that our most fundamental challenge is to develop that willingness in our political system. Let me expand for one moment on this global transformation. Firstly, there has been an enormous increase in the range of goods and services that are subject to trade, partly because of improved transportation, but predominantly because of modern communications technology of the kind that John was describing, with the consequence that, at least potentially, all knowledge-based activities that can be electronically communicatable are subject to trade. Legal research, reading x-rays, investment banking research, software development, and so much else. And secondly, India and China have vast current or potential capacity with 1/3 of the globe's population. They have rapidly increasing productivity due to effective policies in education elsewhere, and they have cost advantages that derive from the fact that, at least at the present time, we have non-market exchange rates. It is true that China and India face their own enormous challenges, and it's certainly possible that they could falter, though that would be in nobody's interest, certainly not our interest, nor theirs. But I've had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with private sector and public sector leaders from both countries, and at least in my judgment, there is no question that they understand their issues and they are committed to doing what is needed to stay on their current track. All of this occurs in a United States where median real wages, and you all as governors know this very well and know the issues this creates, median real wages have been roughly stagnant for the last 5 years and have grown very slowly for 25 of the last 30 years, the only exception being the last 5 years of the 90s. Also, economic dislocation seems to have increased, and economic inequality, favoring a very small tier at the top, certainly has increased. The popular perception in our country, and I might add around the world, is to attribute those circumstances to trade. The reality is far more complex, with technology being a substantially more important factor and a number of other factors being involved as well. I'll get back to trade in one moment. But first, let me say what I think we should do to be successful economically. Start, I believe, economic policy at the federal level and in the states should have 3 objectives: robust economic growth, broad-based participation in that growth, and increased economic security achieved in ways that does not undermine the incentive to work. And I believe that these 3 objectives are mutually reinforcing. President Clinton used to say that sustained growth is the single most effective way of promoting broad economic growth and economic security, both because you have a larger pie to split and because of sustained tight labor markets. And on the other hand, broad income growth and increased security better promotes growth itself, partly because because workers are then better empowered to have access to education, health care, and so much else that contributes to productivity. And secondly, because sound economic policies around trade and market-based economics will not have sustained political support unless the great preponderance of the people believe they're benefiting from those policies. As the governor mentioned, we started about 2 years ago a policy project. This was a group of us, policy people, financial people, and academics, called the Hamilton Project. What we have tried to do is to contribute to the substance of this debate and also to stimulate public debate by developing first a broad-based economic strategy paper, which we issued about a year ago, and then by developing policies pursuant to that strategy, which we're doing on an ongoing basis, with this year a focus on health care, education, and energy. To realize the objectives I set out a moment ago, our nation, in my judgment, must meet challenges that I think of as falling into 4 categories. 1, our multiple financial imbalances. 2, serious shortfalls in so many areas that fall into your purview as governors: education, infrastructure, basic research, energy policy, health care policy, inner city programs, which I view as an economic imperative, our social safety net, and so much else. These are critical requisites for success, economic success for our country, that markets by their very nature will not provide. 3, cost-benefit imbalances in our regulatory and litigation regimes. And 4, international economic policy, which means trade, immigration, and working with other countries to develop flexible exchange rate markets. Let me focus on financial imbalances for a moment. Current economic conditions, as I said a moment ago, sit astride multiple imbalances in our economy. Addressing those imbalances is pretty much entirely the purview of the federal government. Let me focus on our fiscal position first amongst those imbalances. Federal Reserve Board Chairman Ben Bernanke said in testimony a few weeks ago about long-term fiscal matters with a special reference to revenues and to entitlements, and I quote, "We are experiencing what seems likely to be the calm before the storm," unquote. And that storm, he went on to say, could severely undermine our economic well-being. economic well-being. We're certainly capable of avoiding that storm, but only through difficult decisions that are politically and substantively difficult, but which should begin right now. To start, the federal budget window, which is a 10-year window, as you all know, current time involves projections of significant deficits, assuming that the 01 and 03 tax cuts are made permanent, assuming alternative minimum tax reform. We could have and should have had surpluses during this period, given the growth that we've had and given that we started the decade with substantial surpluses, which then would have better enabled us or better equipped us to face our entitlements, our entitlement commitments, and the other imbalances that we face. There's been some improvement recently in deficit numbers and in projected deficits, but that is predominantly due to unexpected tax receipts coming from high rates of corporate taxes and from the skewing of incomes toward high bracket taxpayers. Fundamentally, they do not change the fiscal picture. What they mean is that with sound fiscal policies, we could have been that much better positioned to face our other imbalances instead of having the deficits that we have today. As to the other imbalances, the three major entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, are estimated to increase by 50% as a portion of GDP over the next 15 years. We have a de minimis national savings rate of roughly 2%, compared, for example, to China with roughly 45%. And we have an almost unimaginable trade or current account deficit of about 6% of GDP, compared, for example, to roughly an average of roughly 1.6% during the 1990s. And we have heavy overweighting, as Alan Greenspan has pointed out in his remarks, heavy overweighting toward dollar-denominated assets amongst foreign portfolio managers. The combination of these imbalances, which is a relatively new phenomenon, is a deep threat to our economy. We have been sustained through vast inflows of capital from abroad, in part motivated by a desire to support the dollar in order, in effect, to subsidize exports. But that is exceedingly unlikely to continue indefinitely in the face of these imbalances, though the timing of trouble, whether it's the near term or years out, is impossible to predict. The single most important action that we could take to address all of these imbalances and to minimize the risks that are associated with them is to make politically tough decisions on revenues, on federal programs, and on spending, including entitlements. The objective, in my judgment, should be to establish a fiscal path that systematically reduces the ratio of debt to our economy, that is to say, the ratio of debt to GDP, and leads to balance. And in my view, at least at the same time, we should make room for critical public investments. Obviously, the pace and the specifics of this approach would require very difficult judgments about a whole host of trade-offs. Let me now turn to public investment and the other requisites for a successful economy that must be met by government. And here I believe states and cities can and should play a major role in meeting our nation's challenges, both in traditional areas and in other newer and very far-reaching ways. To begin, education is obviously absolutely critical to how we do in the global economy. And there you all are central to what happens, especially K through 12. Our public school system is almost universally viewed as being far from what it should be. And I believe that states and cities can contribute enormously through educational reform and through demonstrating different approaches to dealing with these problems. Our project, the Hamilton Project, put out a paper in April of last year in which we suggested different approaches to teacher selection, teacher award, teacher advancement. We've also put out papers dealing with summer programs. But these are just some examples of the kinds of things that need to be done and where you all are absolutely central to whether or not our country meets what may be its single greatest challenge with respect to the years and decades ahead. There's another area where change is imperative with both to efficiency and with respect to coverage. There's a tremendous amount that can be done, as John mentioned, through technology. There are many other areas that need to be approached. And obviously states are now getting very much involved in that, in effect providing many ways of leadership in our country. Poverty alleviation is another area. It's a critical economic priority in which states have done a great deal in the past, a great deal more to do. Beyond these traditional areas, state and local measures to build around state and local strengths in order to promote economic growth may often in many ways be more effective than action at the federal level. This is something all of you know far more about than I do. Let me just make a few points, though, to set out the point. States can provide infrastructure. They can provide venture capital. They can provide pilot project funding to catalyze new activities, maybe even new industries, around what may in some ways be our nation's greatest economic resource, our great universities, our great academic health centers, where at the present time, at least, we are unrivaled in the world. The obvious example is the synergy between the private sector in Silicon Valley and Stanford, or the healthcare activities in biotech that have built up around our academic health centers. We can have pilot projects in states with large agricultural resource in order to provide alternatives to developing ethanol, alternatives to corn. Somebody from Iowa here, I guess. There's nothing wrong with corn, but there are also other ways of doing that. Programs to promote manufacturing around our agricultural hubs, and specialized technical education in our K through 12, well, not K, but in our high schools, in our community colleges, and in our universities, to attract knowledge-based activities, especially to areas that naturally attract the kinds of people that those industries need. Our great cities on the one hand, and our great outdoors on the other hand, which have tremendous lifestyle advantages that some people value very highly. While the federal government has to be involved in meeting many of these challenges, the more time I have spent on this question of how to promote economic growth in the context of this transformed environment, the more convinced I've become that states and localities are very well positioned to provide leadership on a great deal of much of what must be done, partly because they have local knowledge, and partly because they can demonstrate different ways of meeting these challenges, which then can become best practices for the country as a whole. And I might add, a way to buttress the strength of the states in this regard would be to have federal funding combined with local knowledge. So you get the benefit of federal fundraising, but local knowledge in terms of providing leadership on the use of those funds. The governor has described her project, Innovation America, which seems to me an exceedingly thoughtful approach, which provides many very good ideas and analysis for states and cities to proceed along lines I've just described. Bruce Katz at the Brookings Institution has a very well-funded undertaking called the Metropolitan Project, which similarly provides a great deal of very important analysis information to follow up along these lines. The governor's project also refers, and I quote, to reducing regulatory barriers, unquote. Clearly, we must maintain appropriate regulatory regimes, and clearly we must have a litigation regime that provides for redress when wrong is done. But it also seems to me that we have to focus very carefully on the cost-benefit excesses in both of these systems, because they have become very serious deterrents to economic activity in this country. If you step back and you look at everything I've just described, I believe that it constitutes a powerful agenda for promoting growth and also for promoting increased incomes and job creation. Let me make one or two brief comments on globalization trade and then wind up. There's an understandable temptation in America today, because of the factors I've mentioned before, stagnant median real wages and the like, to think in terms of creating trade barriers. I think that would be hugely counterproductive. Trade liberalization has resulted in lower consumer prices, lower prices for our producers, lower inflation, and I believe has the benefits of comparative advantage and has driven American business to be more competitive. I believe it has contributed very substantially to economic well-being of the great preponderance of the American people. Furthermore, if we had trade barriers, that could easily lead to retaliation, and it could lead to disruption of our currency. But what we need to do is to combine trade liberalization with an effective and powerful domestic agenda of the kind that I've described before. And the political problem, which you all will relate to, I suspect very well, is that too often those who support trade liberalization don't support the domestic agenda, and those who support the domestic agenda don't support trade liberalization. We need to bring the two together into one politics. Let me conclude by saying that I focused on the challenges that face our country, because I do believe that our future will depend on how well we address those challenges. But as we think about our country, I think it is always very, very important to keep in mind that we have enormous strengths and that we have had a history of great resilience in rising to meet our challenges. I believe that we can thrive in the years and decades ahead. I believe we can make change our friend, not our enemy. But to do all of that, our political system, and here I believe governors will be absolutely central, must rise once again, as it has so often in the past, to address the tough issues of momentous times. Thank you all very much.
Thank you both for those very thoughtful remarks. I'm going to throw the table open to questions, comments from the governors that are here. Yes, Governor Strickland.
I would like to ask the Secretary, how do you explain the difference in the savings rate, 2% in America and 45% in China? Could you elaborate on that?
It's a very good question, Governor. When I was at Treasury, Larry Summers, as I said, my deputy, who had done a lot of his academic work around that, and I and others spent a ton of time on it. I'll give you two comments, if I may. One, I came away convinced, at least, that there's very little we can do in that regard through tax policy, that basically savings are not much affected by what you do in the tax area. And secondly, it is probably predominantly a cultural phenomenon. And so the question is, how do you address a very complex cultural phenomenon? We had some ideas, but I frankly think it's very difficult. One possibility would be, by the way, to make 401ks, IRAs, and all those kinds of programs opt out so that you automatically enrolled unless you opt out. Oddly enough, that little change can have a considerable behavioral effect. But more fundamentally, I think it's predominantly a cultural issue. We have to approach it in that way.
Governor Lynch.
Thank you. I have a question for John Chambers. John, in other industries, the introduction of technology has the benefit of increasing quality, lowering costs, and also personalizing the products that are delivered. Does that same analogy apply to the delivery of public education? Not in terms of what we teach, but how it's delivered to our students.
I think it's almost identical when you think about what is possible for public education. We've seen this in every industry where we've addressed it. There's the upfront cost, which all of us understand, whether it's in business or in government or education, that you must address, and then you can build off of it. But education is probably one of the trickiest fields, and I'll give you an example of what we've seen at Cisco. We did these network academies that we shared with you. The network academies, 91% of the students use their skills every day after they graduate. 79% of them pursued more IT basis. 29% of them went into careers in IT. And that was a program that just started in 1997. Its payback for the students was dramatic. We helped fund it, and once you got over that leverage point, we can now have 10,000 of them worldwide for the same price we did the first 500. And so we've learned how to scale effectively. What we, however, learned at the same time is the curriculum, and this gives you an idea how fast education is changing, which was just started 10 years ago, is obsolete today. And we had to dramatically change the curriculum and break it into more manageable pieces. First of all, the students didn't want to take a course that they might not get an A in, because that could affect which college they get into. Secondly, for those that didn't want to pursue a career long-term in IT, they wanted IT basics. Third, those who wanted to use it for small to medium business type of activity needed a different group, and we had to change that dramatically. Until we changed the education, we dropped from 120,000 students in the program in the US to 67,000. We went from 18% of them being women to 13%. In Africa and the Middle East, the percentage of women is 25 and 28% as an example. And the point that I'm making is not only is it the upfront cost you have to address, you also have to constantly change the curriculum to create jobs. So when people see they take an education, they can draw the direct correlation to get a job after. But your basic premise is absolutely right.
Questions? Governor Spitzer?
Secretary Rubin, to a certain extent, it seems that the differential in savings rates is helping us right now in the sense that the 45% savings in China, that, to a great extent, those funds are flowing here. And my concern is, and my question is, if there comes a moment when that enormous pool of capital stops flowing in to subsidize us, what happens? And secondarily, if I could, because obviously 2% won't be enough to pay for what you laid out in terms of an investment agenda, how do we pay long-term for the your second sort of category of education, healthcare, broadband that John mentioned, those enormous public infrastructure investments, when that money supply dries up, when we have that fiscal imbalance that you talked of, which is to a certain extent, and here's the question, being driven by what you referred to very blandly, and you hid the phrase in there, non-market exchange rates, and it sounds very benign. What do we do about that as states, because we don't, unlike the feds, print money?
You're not supposed to. Oh yeah, you're not supposed to.
We could try.
And I guess if you decide you do want to do it, Governor, they have some federal programs to deal with you. But leave that aside. No, look, I think you asked what is really a fundamentally very, very good question. I don't think it's the differential, actually, that's helped us. What's helped us is their enormous savings rate. We'd be better off with a higher savings rate. Another thing we could do, by the way, then the quickest thing we could do to help our savings rate would be to have the surpluses we really should have had during this period of economic growth, because that translates right into savings. Look, but you've hit on what in some ways is the nub of a very serious problem. We have benefited enormously from the savings in China and other countries, but it's an ironic situation in which these emerging market countries, which traditionally you would have thought of as absorbers of savings, are actually heavily saving and exporting their savings to us, the richest country in the world. It isn't going to go on forever. It may go on for a long time. It may go on for years, or it may stop tomorrow. I don't have any way to tell. But fundamentally, at some point, I think it is almost inconceivable that that kind of situation continue in the face of our imbalances. And as I said a moment ago, the most immediate thing that we could do to try to address that is to have much sounder fiscal policy. There's also always the risk in these kinds of situations, and hopefully this won't happen, but there's always the risk that instead of having a nice gradual adjustment, there's some kind of a disruptive occurrence, and that will come from a lack of confidence. The best way to buttress confidence, and this was after what we advised every other country in the world to do in the 1990s, the best way to buttress confidence is to have sound fiscal policy. So I think that really is imperative. You asked the question of where the resources are going to come from. Let me just say that people like yourself, Governor, the people who actually run this country, not private citizens like me who'll go home and play tennis or something, are going to have to make some very tough decisions. And my own instinct is to think that some way or another you are going to need to have greater revenues than you have today in order to meet the challenges that our country has. And I know the politics of that are extremely difficult, but I think it's the reality of life. We had considerably higher revenues as a percent of GDP all through the 90s, and while it was predicted that that was going to result in economic demolition, the fact is we had the longest economic expansion in the nation's history. We had 22 million new jobs and one thing another, so it certainly did not undermine economic growth, quite the contrary. On the exchange rates? That's a tough issue. I think Hank Paulson, actually, as Secretary of Treasury, is doing a very good job. What he fundamentally is doing is trying to work quietly and effectively with the Chinese, and I think that's exactly the right thing, and I think he's really I think what he is doing is exactly right. The problem is that they're very focused on their own stability and protecting their exports, and so I think it's always going to go slower than we would have liked, but I think he's taking the right approach.
Governor, if I could add to that.
Yeah, John?
When we were together 5 years ago, we talked about productivity. In 1997, a decade ago, we said productivity, which had traditionally run at 1 to 2% a year, was not only too low, but it was sustainable at 2 to 3%, and 3 to 5% was very probable in well-run companies. And the reason I bring this up, that is even more important than the savings rates. And we outlined what most people did not agree with at that point in time, and yet all of us know we've achieved unusually high productivity. I would argue not only can that be sustained, but actually increased. And if you increase that, whether it's in your budgets within the state or within the country or within our own businesses, that determines where I keep my jobs, it determines the profitability. We drive our own productivity at 10% a year. We are 2 to 3 times more productive than any of our large peers around the world. That's how we compete with our Asian competitors. And we don't get satisfied with that. We've learned how to drive it further and either bring it to the bottom line or apply new resources and move jobs around within it. And one of the toughest things to teach our company to do was moving the resources in one agency, if you will, using the terminology of government, to another, and creating an award system that rewarded people for doing that. I actually think there's plenty of money in the system, and if we learn how to really continuously drive productivity and realign resources and teach people in terms of the skill sets to move in these areas, I think that might be the biggest advantage we have as a country.
Good. Governor Manchin?
If I might, to John Chambers, as those of you who don't know, John's a native West Virginian who was born and bred and educated in West Virginia, and we're very proud of. As we say back home,
thank you, Governor.
As we say back home, he's a hometown boy, did well. With that being said, John, knowing the the challenges that we have in rural states such as West Virginia. You talked about broadband being the new infrastructure as part of the key. It's going to take a public-private partnership. I know Cisco's been very active and aggressive in this. Is there more corporate America working with states that everyone's going to benefit by being wired, if you will, so we can compete on a global market? What access do we have to that, and how do we work with you, such as companies at Cisco?
If you look at the requirement for broadband, I really believe what several of the states have done in terms of outlining a policy to get that to all their citizens. Some of the states will have more challenges based upon their density and will have to use different technologies. The second issue is you've got to make sure there's enough competition, but not too much. And I believe there is enough with the consolidation that's going on with AT&T and Verizon and with Comcast and Time Warner, etc. Then you've got to say, what can I do to help these businesses, these service providers build out faster within the state? And if you have a policy of predictability and people have a reasonable assumption on how they get the return, I think it's something that is very manageable over the next 3 to 5 years. If you were to say, do I think every West Virginian could have broadband access 5 years from now who wanted to? I think with the right policies and programs that you can, and I think businesses will be willing to work together to do that.
Governor Barber?
Thank you, Governor. I just want to tell John Chambers and Cisco thank you for the program that they have done in Mississippi, where they, after the hurricane, came in and put in infrastructure technology to help a large group of our schools in the most affected area. And Joe, in Mississippi, we would say that John is a hometown boy that done good.
Other questions? Governor Chris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Rubin, you touched on the issue of ethanol production, and I hesitate to ask you this because I'm sitting next to the governor of Iowa, but I'll do it anyway. Corn obviously has been utilized significantly, but from a Florida perspective, we've thought a lot about the use of sugar and citrus waste, and I didn't know if you had any comment or study that you could share with us about that.
Let me ask you a question, if I may. By the way, you are my home state. I grew up in Florida.
Well,
but you don't have to take pride in that. I can see you. I don't feel offended. I just want to make the point.
You shouldn't be offended. I just didn't know that.
I am told, and here's something I don't know too much about, but you probably know more than I do, that Brazil is now a substantial exporter of ethanol, and they're using sugarcane.
Yes, sir.
Yes, that's right.
And that the problem that we have is we have this whole set of subsidies and one thing and another built up around the sugar industry that is preventing us from being competitive in doing that. And I don't know if that's right or not, but that's what I've heard, and it seems to me if that's right, that's the way you begin to address that.
How about the citrus waste, though? I mean, have you had a chance to see any studies related to that?
I don't know about that. The cellulosis is something that the auto companies, for example, are enormously focused on. And I suspect if you really wanted information, they could give you a ton of it.
Sure. Thank you.
Other questions? I have a question that takes us back to the initiative, and I'd like to ask both of our speakers in terms of, John, you laid out a very technology-savvy future for us. What are the skill sets the workers you need to sustain that future are going to have? And then Secretary Rubin, you described a world economy that is in a very transformational stage right now. What, in your view, is the single greatest mistake we could make at this transformational time?
In terms of the skill sets that our students are going to need, I think we all understand the importance of math and science, but that really is just a basis of learning how to learn. And I think that's really the skill sets that are most important, because what we do in our occupation will not only change 2 to 3 times during our career in our generation, it will probably change in our children's 5 to 10 times. So learning how to learn. The second thing is learning how to really collaborate effectively together, because I think that is a large part of the future. Now, in terms of the technology, many of us around this room might be thinking, John, what you're really saying to enable technology, I've got to really develop keyboard skills and really understand operating systems, etc. The technology of the future, we as vendors, whether it's Intel, Craig Barrett's here, or other people in the industry, will make this very easy to use. In fact, if it's complex, it won't get used. You'll be able to take new technology devices to your home, rotating pictures that will basically show whatever picture you want off an electronic frame. You'll be able to not program that self. It will automatically, when you plug it in, tell your TV, do you want to add this to your devices? Yes, you will, and you'll download pictures to it. The point that I'm making is we'll make these simple, they'll be converged, you'll communicate in whatever format you want. So it's more how to harness the power of the technology and how to learn to change process that I think the skills of the future need to be.
Secretary?
Trying to think of a way to respond to a single greatest mistake that enabled me to say a bunch of things. No,
Subparts.
Subpart. No, I won't do that. I could do semicolons, but I won't. No, I think the single greatest mistake we could make would be, and I said this in my remarks, would be to fail to have a very substantial change in our political system's willingness to make very tough decisions. And I think in that respect, three that I would mention, I do think that we have got to have a world-class public education system. I think that we have got to address our long-term fiscal situation, and I think we should not try to restrict trade.
Very good. Thank you. Let's give our speakers another. We're going to adjourn this session now. There will be an immediate quick session of the Executive Committee. As a group, we will reconvene promptly at 3 o'clock. At that point in time, we'll be starting to dive into state-by-state analyses of where we're at. So if you're not on the Executive Committee, I'll see you promptly back here at 3. If you are at the Executive Committee, I guess we're meeting, Ray, right up here? Right here. Right here. Buy the chocolates that Governor Lingle brought from Hawaii. Okay, thank you all.
I don't
If you missed any of our coverage of the National Governors Association plenary sessions today, the one that started at 10 and this one that started just a short time ago, 90 minutes ago, we will re-air them tonight at beginning at 3 a.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN. And a reminder that our live coverage of the